Hi, I'm Chris Niokis with PACT Learning Center, and this is a presentation on ethics and human rights. Our learning objectives today are to define what ethics means, look at the history, ethical codes, human rights, risk, and rights restrictions. Merriam-Webster defines ethics as a set of moral principles, a series or system of moral values. This system of moral standards often reflects the values of society at large. Without an established ethical foundation, professions may unintentionally drift into a territory which may be morally questionable. Ethical codes are needed to ensure that professionals do not put individual clients or research participants at risk emotionally or physically. When the subject of ethics is mentioned, one may picture a person with ill intent blatantly attempting to harm or deceive others. The history of helping profession illustrates the opposite to be true. Many ethical violations are committed not by incompetence or cruelness, but by individuals who are intent on helping others. These professionals may be left to figure out how to survive in an environment of scarce resources or following orders without clear regulatory oversight. The events of World War II sparked a closer look at human rights and the moral responsibilities of society. The subsequent Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 1946 contributed to the creation of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. This document served as a basis of a global moral outline for the minimum standards of humane treatment. Many helping professions were left to define their own ethical guidelines independently using the United Nations document as a template. Although there was some broad agreement regarding the ethical treatment on a macro level, specific professions were left to determine their codes of conduct individually. The American Psychological Association developed its Code of Ethics in 1953. The document was over 100 pages long and described vignettes and the prescribed response for practitioners to follow. However, not all contingencies could be accounted for prior to their occurrence, which made this problematic. The treatment of people with developmental or intellectual disabilities began to garner more attention during the Kennedy administration. Rosemary Kennedy, the oldest sister in the Kennedy family, was said to have some mild intellectual disabilities until age 23, when she was given a frontal lobotomy that left her completely incapacitated. In 1961, JFK established a task force to focus on what at the time was called mental retardation. In 1963, the DD Assistance and Bill of Rights was enacted. In 1970, the case of Wyatt versus Stickney helped to establish some of the regulations that we still see today. The QIDP, which was then known as the QMRP, certification was developed, safe client-to-staff ratios were established, behavior intervention plans were required, and regulations regarding the physical structures of facilities were determined. More importantly, this is when it was established that participants have the right to treatment. In other words, maintaining individuals in large institutions with no meaningful programming was no longer acceptable. 1972 saw more legal challenges, such as Mills versus the Board of Education, which established that all children are entitled to an education regardless of the severity of their disability. Also in 1972 was the case of New York ARC versus Rockefeller, which was a class action lawsuit filed in response to the conditions at Willowbrook State School in New York. Willowbrook was an institution that supported individuals with intellectual, developmental, and physical disabilities from 1947 to 1987. Like many institutions of the time, Willowbrook suffered from overcrowding and understaffing, at one point housing 6,000 individuals in a facility designed for 4,000. In 1965, Senator Robert F. Kennedy toured the institution and commented on the conditions and offered suggestions to correct the problems he observed. However, no noticeable improvements were made. Despite regular media coverage, little was done to address the conditions at Willowbrook. In 1972, reporter Geraldo Rivera investigated the allegations of abuse, neglect, and overcrowding at the institution. Because of the inhumane conditions, the class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the participants, and in 1980, a federal law was passed outlining minimum requirements for the care of individuals with disabilities. Willowbrook State School, then named Staten Island Developmental Center, closed in 1987. More recently, in 2005, the lawsuit Liggess v. Hamas was filed to address the lack of housing options for individuals with developmental disabilities residing in intermediate care facilities, or ICFDDs, serving 9 or more individuals. The lawsuit sought to provide greater housing options for people residing in ICFDDs who would prefer to live in smaller community-based living arrangements, or SILAs, or receive home-based services. In 2011, the state of Illinois settled the Liggess suit and developed a plan to implement the services outlined in the lawsuit. The settlement defines the individuals covered, remedies required, as well as a process for implementation and oversight. The contrast in the focus of the Willowbrook and Liggess lawsuits illustrates the progress that has occurred in the field of developmental disabilities. While Willowbrook focused on establishing basic rights for people receiving residential services, Liggess seeks to provide choice to meet the needs of the individual served. While some details may differ, most codes of ethics in social services are similar. These guidelines generally do not conflict and will have the same underlying themes of beneficence, which is helpfulness, and non-malfeasance, which is to do no harm. Guidelines for working within the scope of one's professional competency, confidentiality, dual relationships, and research and publication are usually covered similarly in all codes. Any person working in a social service environment is beholden to some sort of rule structure, whether it be mandated reporter status, QIDP certification, Board of Education guidelines, or direct support professional code of conduct. The ethical code developed by the National Alliance of Direct Support Professionals and the Illinois State Board of Education Code of Ethics are provided at the end of this presentation for review. Individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities are guaranteed the same constitutional rights as typically functioning individuals. Any restrictions to those rights must be carefully considered and deemed appropriate by the treatment team, governing bodies, or outside entities before being implemented. Any restriction should also be considered temporary and a plan put in place to assist the person in gaining the skills to remove those restrictions. The following is a summary of rights that are protected by the State of Illinois Department of Human Services. Retention of rights, which means that the person is still able to maintain all of their legal and civil rights while receiving services. Non-discrimination, the right to select their own providers, freedom from abuse and neglect, freedom from restraint unless the person is a threat to themselves or others, and then restraint is only used as a last resort. Freedom from seclusion, the right to confidentiality and privacy, and the right to maintain their personal property, and the right to control their own finances and banking. Individuals have a right to be paid for work performed, the right to medical and dental services, the right to hold meetings, the right to refuse treatment, freedom from involuntary discharge of services, expression of grievances, the right to access of their clinical record, freedom from restrictions, the right to exercise the rights that they have, and the right to report any violations of their rights. The nature of an individual's disability may increase the level of support required to perform certain tasks. This level of support is determined by the completion of a risk assessment. During a risk assessment, the treatment team looks at domains such as health, safety in the home, safety in the community, safety in school or workplace, finances, and behavior to determine what level of support is needed for the individual to safely navigate specific settings or situations. This is based on the individual's need. Blanket restrictions cannot be implemented. Try as we may, risk cannot be completely eliminated. Novel situations occur all the time that no one could have anticipated. Risk is inevitable, and to try to shield people from all risk can limit their ability to learn and grow. Learning requires risk-taking, which may result in emotional or physical pain, and that's okay. That's healthy to a degree. Without learning opportunities, people may remain stagnant and their quality of life may be diminished. Everyone has the right to make choices and learn from the consequences of those choices. Our job is to make sure the risk taken is appropriate for the individual served and help build on that learning. As Gandhi said, freedom is not worth having if it does not include the freedom to make mistakes. Exercising some rights may be restricted if there is a substantial risk to the person. The risk must be identified, the least restrictive course of action decided by a treatment team, and then presented to a human rights committee. Examples of rights restrictions include locks on doors, limited access to food, alarms on doors, limited access to money, or limited access to property. So let's take a look at some real-life examples of situations that we see and look at what the rights restrictions may be and how to work with that. Example 1. Participant A continuously enters participant B's room and takes his book. When this happens, participant B exhibits self-injurious behaviors. The treatment team would discuss options, and perhaps they determined that putting a lock on participant B's door would be helpful as it would keep participant A out. However, this is a rights restriction because although it does keep participant A out of the room, it also limits participant B's access to his own room. So to help with that, the team could put a plan into place to teach participant B to independently access his room. This would go to Behavior Management Committee, as this would be a solution to helping the self-injurious behavior. And from BMC, it would go to the Human Rights Committee for approval. Let's take a look at example 2. Participant C has a severe peanut allergy requiring the exclusion of all peanut products in the group home or in the classroom. This is actually a rights restriction for everyone else in that group home. So, in order for peanut products to be eliminated from the home, this would go to HRC, who would approve this, and because this is a pretty severe risk, it would definitely be approved. The other participants would be able to eat the peanut products when they're not in the group home. There wouldn't be a plan to regain the right to have peanut products in the group home because unless that person moves out of the group home, the other participants would not be able to gain access to peanut products in the home. However, it would be put in place that if they really wanted a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, they could have that when they were out of the group home. So let's review some of the points that we discussed today. Many changes have occurred regarding the treatment of individuals with intellectual disabilities. These changes have led to an evolution in ethical codes for people who work with these individuals, as well as a focus on the legal and civil rights of people receiving services. Any steps to restrict the rights of anyone must be thoughtfully considered for the individual as a result of a risk that is present for that individual. Risk will never be eliminated as the nature of learning involves risk-taking. The individuals we serve deserve the right to try new things and learn from the resulting consequences of that attempt. They will either learn how to do something or learn a new way how not to do something. Either way, this is a learning experience. Thank you for your time and attention, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thanks.